Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Snecker Show. My name is Ben and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my thickness planer and my Christmas present, which was this Shelix cutter head, which I'm so excited about. I got it in the saw already. I've been using it a little bit, but I have learned a lot since I bought the thing, and if you're watching this video, you might be thinking about buying one of these things too, and therefore you know that it's not a small investment. These cost about $400 for the DeWalt DW735 thickness planer. And there are some things that I wish I would have known before I bought it, and I'm going to pass that on to you hopefully before you make your decision. So before we get started, just in case anybody doesn't know what the Shelix cutter head is, we'll pop off the top of this thing and take a look on the inside. If you've never opened one of these things up before, if you have one that already uses knives, you'll have to do this at some point. You just take out those four set screws in the top. The wrench for doing so is hidden inside there, very convenient. And then you take off these three red screws, and they hold this dust chute in place. And you crack that open, just bend it up so it gets loose here, and there you go. I took off the top and I took off the dust chute, and that exposes this beautiful carbide tipped Shelix helical cutter head. If you aren't familiar with thickness planers, what comes with the thing originally is this cutter head. It's round, it has three knives on it. These knives go on the inside there. But you got three knives, so when it spins around, the knives will shear off the surface of the board to flatten it out and get it to a uniform thickness. So with the Shelix, you pop this one out. You got to take a few parts off the side. I'm not going to get into how to do it. They have instructions on their website that are very easy to follow. But you take this thing out, slide that thing in, and then instead of a straight steel knife, you have all these small carbide ones. And the quick pros and cons. The steel one, the steel is going to be a little bit softer. It is double-sided, which is nice, so that if you ruin one side, you can flip it around. But whenever you hit a nail or something, or even just a really hard knot, or a piece of wood chips off, it's going to put a little nick in the knife, and that'll usually hit all three knives at the same time because of the speed at which it's spinning. So what happens then is that when you run your board through and it cuts it, you end up with like a ridge, a line running along your board that you will then have to sand off or scrape off later. And I found sometimes too that it will even compress. You get that ridge on there, but the ridge is somewhat compressed because it's a nick. It's a dull spot on the knife, so it pushes the wood fibers down, doesn't shear them off, and still leaves that ridge. So sometimes even when you sand it and then put on a finish, you can see where that line once was. So anyway, these things are pretty good until you do some damage to it. And then they have you can see the elongated holes there. So what you can do initially is when you get a nick or two in the knives, you can offset them. You can shift them one way or the other to try to offset so that the nicks don't line up. But eventually you just got to throw this out. Now, these are around $30 for a set of three, and you can use both sides. If you flip them all at the same time, then you get two uses out of each one. So the total cost when you ruin a set of knives, flip it, ruin that side, and get rid of it is $30, or about $5 per edge, or $15 per edge set, if that makes sense. Doesn't matter. Moving on to this one, instead of paying $30 a set, now I've had this planer for probably 3 years. I'm a hobby woodworker. I do use it, I use it an okay amount. I plane my own wood, so I run all the stuff, or I saw my own lumber, so I run the stuff that I mill through there, but not an excessive amount. I've been through probably about $120 worth of these guys since I bought this saw maybe 3 years ago. A lot of that was due to things like end grain cutting boards and just harder woods like ash and running into knots and figure or foreign objects in the wood. So these steel knives go by very quickly, but if you have the carbide ones, the nice thing about these carbide teeth on here is that, first of all, you have 4 edges. So if one edge gets damaged, you don't have to replace the entire thing all the way across. You just take it out and rotate it, and you got a fresh cutting edge on there on the side. And eventually you go through all 4, but you have 4 edges to go through. That's going to take a long time because the carbide is going to stay sharp a lot longer than the steel ones will. And again, if you get a nick in one of these blades here, you just take that one off, and that's it. You don't have to replace the whole thing. So one of these is probably around $5. I actually haven't checked. It comes with 5 spares when you buy it, or when you get the Shelix in the box. But if these are $5 each, and you get 4 edges on them, that means you're going for about $1.25 per edge on one of these knives, as opposed to $5 an edge on the other one. So the longer you have your planer, the more this is going to pay for itself. But initially, it is kind of a big investment. The other advantage to this over the straight knife is that the straight knife, you have when it's cutting a piece of wood and it spins around and cuts into it, the whole thing is hitting out once, and it's hitting it straight. It's not shearing like when you would normally slice something. So I don't know if it's visible on this, but there's a lot of fuzz on this board, and this is some ambrosia maple, and it's kind of soft, and I have a lot of these that just get really fuzzy when I run them through, and they tear out a lot. And this straight cut doesn't really do a whole lot to prevent that. In fact, it's what causes it. If you have grain that runs uphill and downhill, you're really going to get a lot of tear out with these straight knives. Now, if you're using the Shelix with the helical pattern, it's a shear cut. You can see because it's at an angle. So each one of those knives is getting more of a shearing action like that. So it's a lot better for pieces of wood with complicated grain like this. And at the end, I'll do some cuts on all of these, but really, the reason you clicked on this video is because I said it was the video that I wish I watched before I bought a Shelix cutter head. So let's talk about that part. First of all, it's important to note that there are 2 different options for buying a Shelix cutter head for the DW735 planer. One is the original manufacturer diameter. It's the exact same diameter as this thing with the knives included. And the other one is the smaller diameter. It's just slightly undersized so that when you push it through the hole that this bearing fits into, it doesn't scratch up the inside of the hole. So the OEM diameter one, you need to remove all of the individual teeth from the Shelix so that you can fit it through, just the metal body or the steel body. But for the smaller diameter one, the idea is that you can slide the whole thing through without having to remove the teeth. You just have maybe a 1/16 of an inch thinner diameter on this guy. So just to recap, what I put inside this thickness planer was the undersized cutter head, not the OEM one. So that means that now the cutter head is slightly higher in relation to the rubber infeed and outfeed rollers inside there. When you push in your piece of wood, of course, the rollers grab it and push the wood through. The cutter head shears a little off the surface, and then the outfeed roller pushes it out the other side. So now, the first thing that happened was that I saw that my depth gauge was a little bit off. So I've recalibrated that, but if you notice, this screw was originally in there, and then there were 2 screws in here. So I had to move this whole thing up about 1/4 of an inch. I'm surprised it was that much, but I had to take, the screw is in the old screw hole, but I had to take this metal piece off, and I ended up grinding a little off the top. So you can see there, where it says, I think it says depth, or said depth removal gauge. I had to cut off that top line on the grinder to slide this up far enough so that when I'm right on 0 here, that I'm actually on 0, because this thing was way off before. And that's just because of the cutter head being a little bit higher. And of course, also that means that this was going to be off, so I had to readjust this thing. And that also means that this guy over here for setting your depth, that was now off, so I had to come down here and readjust this bolt that serves as the stop for this thing. So if you want to have repeatable 1/2 inch cuts, you set it to 1/2 inch, and then you lower your planer until it hits that bolt. So I saved a little bit of time in having to remove all of the knives off of the cutter head, the new one, but then I had to spend probably an extra ½ hour at least to pull this thing off of here, grind it down, actually modify the planer, and then recalibrate all of the depth settings. And now I'm still noticing that one of the more frustrating parts is that even after I got everything very precise, I mean, these things are dead on now. That thing right there, if I put it on 1/2 inch, it comes out almost exactly 1/2 inch using calipers, but the rollers are still putting a little bit of extra pressure on these boards. So what I'm finding, the first one that really stood out was this piece of plum. I decided to try this out since it's got some cool figure, and this would be a good test to see if a helical cutter head can get through this without tearing it up. So after it came out of the saw, the finish is pretty nice, but after I made a couple passes, I noticed, if you can, I don't know if you're going to see the reflection on that, but those little black spots are kind of shiny, right? So I just had a moment of brief panic, and I thought that, there's one right there. What I thought had happened was that my carbides had already chipped, and that, because this plum wood is so hard, I thought that the carbides chipped and that they had become embedded into my piece of wood. But what was actually happening, those little shiny spots, I finally determined that they are pieces of bark that chipped off as this was going through, and that there was debris all over the bottom here. And because of the amount of pressure that those new rollers are placing on the piece of wood, the pieces of bark that were down on the table here got just fused into this piece of wood. And what you're looking at there, when you see the shininess, that's just from being pushed down and drug across the metal as the board goes through. So I'm just finding now that everything that I push through here seems to have a lot more, I can feel the extra pressure on it. And a lot of times we can do an example, but when the boards are coming out the other side, what happens a lot after they get through the knives and get on the last roller is they'll actually pick up as they come out and then drop down once they get through, because the roller is putting so much pressure that it makes the board rise up a little bit, which means it must be flexing that table in there a little, because the table is, I mean, it's perfectly flat, but it has to be flexing that table to get the board to actually curl up. Because these things, I got these outfeed rollers or outfeed tables perfectly flat and in line with the surface. I put a 4-foot level across the inside to get these just right. So I know those are good, but yeah, those new rollers, that extra 32nd of an inch of pressure is way more than the manufacturer of the tool intended to put down, to put on the wood. So in conclusion, I would say that if you're going to upgrade your DeWalt to a new Shelix cutter head, absolutely do it. It's a great improvement. The Shelix cutter head is awesome. I've really enjoyed it so far. However, do not try to save yourself 30 minutes of time by buying the undersized one so that you don't have to remove all those little cutters off the Shelix. Buy the OEM one. It's going to be way more work and way more aggravation in the long run to get the undersized one and then have to go and readjust all your stuff. So don't make that mistake. I regret making that mistake, and I'm almost thinking about selling this thing, or selling it with the cutter head and then getting a new one with the right size cutter head, taking a little bit of loss on the cost of the saw, just because I know I'm going to have it for so long and I want the right one in there. Just something to keep in mind. Don't make a decision based on 30 minutes of installation time. Make the decision based on what is going to be best for you in the long term. So having said that, let's run a couple of boards through and see how this thing works. The 4 pieces of wood that I'm going to plane for this test are this laminated piece of ash and purple heart. I'm going to see if I can get this to focus right, but you'll see that the Purple Heart is very badly torn out. There's a big chip out of this side, just a big chunk missing. And I planed this a long time ago with the old planer. It just didn't turn out right, but I'm going to see if we can fix that. And then I have a piece of ambrosia maple, and let's see, that's probably the best angle to look at that. You can see how rough this part of the board is. It's just terribly torn out. Some softer wood. This way you can really see the chunks that came out from planing it before. The grain is a little bit confusing on this one. It goes up on the other side, I think. So no matter which way I turned this before, I couldn't get it to turn out just right. So we'll try this one. And then I have one other piece of ambrosia maple. And this, again, this is a very fuzzy piece of wood. So I'm hoping that that will all get cleaned up. And lastly, I'm going to try this end grain cutting board with a variety of different kinds of wood in here. It got some cracks in it that I filled in, but still not too happy with the cracks. This is chestnut oak. It's some very hard wood, and it just didn't hold up with the wood movement being restricted in there. So I'm going to try this one last and see how well it does with end grain. You can probably see that line right there, which is from the old knives that had a little bit of a nick and left that ridge on there. This is very hard to sand out in an end grain one. Usually it's better to plane it out with a hand plane, with a low angle block plane, and then sand it. So I'll try this one last. Well, let's take a look at the results. This is the piece of ashen Purple Heart. You can see the other side is a little bit more purple because it was older. That came out beautifully. I don't see any tear out in there at all. And it completely got rid of, you can see the sort of reflective light spot there where that big chip was, because the grain's a little complicated, and it just handled that with no trouble whatsoever. So that looks great. Very pleased with that one. Next was the piece of fuzzy ambrosia maple, and I maybe still have a few. These might have been left over from the last one. There's a little bit of fuzziness on there, but for the most part it seemed to have cleaned all of that off. and I think this just looks great. That's a cool piece of figure right there. And then I had one more piece of ambrosia maple that had a lot of chipping, and it looks again like this piece came out very nice. There's a little bit of fuzz right there, which I'm not sure if that was just a leftover, but that's certainly nothing compared to the chipping that was on there before. Overall, this thing looks very nice, and I could probably just do a little bit of light sanding to get rid of that fuzz. And lastly, the real challenge is cutting end grain stuff. That's one thing I love about this planer, is that it's dual speed, so I can slow it down for things like this, because if you go full speed, well, let's just say I might have killed a rigid thickness planer doing that. So it's funny, it actually feels a little bit rougher on the side that was done by the Helix. Not like in an unfixable way, but it just feels like the grain is a little more fuzzy, not like the surface is uneven. But yeah, this was the side that was done with the straight knives, and you can see that ridge that the knife left on there. And apparently I already have a little nick in one of my carbides, probably from that piece of plum wood that I looked at earlier. I think when I flipped it over and those pieces of bark were flattened down and embedded into the wood, that might have caused a slight nick in my carbide knives. So I got that little ridge going across there, and that's fixable. I mean, I can barely feel it, probably sand out pretty easily, but it is definitely there. So that's something I'm going to have to keep in mind. I may have to rotate one of those knives already, but I would consider that pretty successful. I mean, it's flat, it's smooth. I don't feel any snipe on the end of the board, so I would consider this 4 successful tests with the Shelix. It's a big improvement over the straight knives, and I'm looking forward to finding some more challenging pieces of wood to push through there. So that's all I got. I hope this helps you make a good decision, and I think that decision is to not buy the undersized cutter head, but if you do get a Shelix, I'm pretty sure you're going to be very happy with the results. So have fun. Do some shopping and get you some new toys. Thanks for watching.